Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bench Maji Gesha Wash Processed Ethiopia from Sloth Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And I believe Sloth is technically based out of both Kobe and Osaka. But a quick shout out to Alan Tran, the Sizzling Sloth himself. If you know, you know. But this is Sloth's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And this coffee was also a gift to us from Lucy. So once again, a quick shout out to and thank you to Lucy for this coffee. Now, of the 4 coffees that Lucy did bring us back from Japan, Sloth is one of the coffee roasters that I had the least amount of familiarity with, as they're a coffee roaster whose name I'd only heard once in passing, so I didn't even know which city they were technically based out of. But since this one is a wash-processed Ethiopian Gesha, it'll definitely make for an interesting review, as this right here is day 53. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Lilo's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Of the 4 coffees that we are discussing that we did receive from Japan recently, this one was definitely on the lighter side of things, as I would say that it was lighter than the coffee we had from both Lilo and Solcott. And in comparison to the only other Osaka-based coffee roaster that we have reviewed on this channel, which was Aoma, it was definitely lighter than that one as well. Now, once again, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the lightest coffee out there, as it is still pretty on par with a lot of other Japanese-based coffee roasters, but for that reason, we can say it's probably a little closer to that true medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 25, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was offering an abundance of papery qualities, as it was the most prominent first experience of the coffee itself. As mentioned, it's not quite as developed as the other Japanese-based coffee roasters, but at the same time, not overly light either. Some very slight generic stone fruit qualities felt in the finish, but for the most part, it was just a okay first impression based off of everything. Day 28 through the Chemex, and it really wasn't much better on the second impression, as it feels like there's a little less of the earlier papery qualities, but for the most part it's not particularly well defined in any sense, as there's a very generic Ethiopian characteristic to it, and I certainly felt like plenty of adjustments were needed within this coffee, as there isn't anything that was overly defining about it. Day 31 through the UFO brewer, and there's been very little change based off of these first 3 days, as the coffee is still very papery with very little outside of that. A slight candied sweetness in the finish, but for the most part it's been pretty tame and toned down with some black tea-like characteristics to it as well, so Ethiopian-like in that sense, but for the most part it's very little outside of that paperiness. Day 34 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so Lilo's recipe. And the coffee was by far the best that it had been to this point, as it's still a little papery even for a washed Ethiopian coffee. I should say for a washed Ethiopian Gesha, as I'm used to having washed Ethiopian coffees that do have that papery quality, but it's much more rare that I actually get that from an Ethiopian Gesha. It's significantly better as it does cool down, as there's the first presence of a little bit of the sweet candy feel. So this one actually did have English notes, so I had a little bit more information as to what to expect with this coffee, and having a little bit more of that candied aspect certainly helped, as of up to this moment it had just been essentially paperiness. Otherwise, it does offer a pretty bright citric quality to it and better definition, so significantly better this time around, and I found out that going lower on the extraction of this one definitely seemed to help. Day 37 through the Chemex, and the coffee is better as it continues to have less of the papery qualities to it, and a slight savory meat-like aspect to it, which does seem to dissipate at room temperature. Off brew, this coffee wasn't particularly impressive, as it had an abundance of either papery or savory qualities at times, but once it did cool down, you were getting significantly better definition to the fruit qualities, especially in terms of a more prominent lemon and a better bit of stone fruits to it as well. So coffee seems to be improving, papery quality seems to be dissipating. Let's go ahead and move on to day 40, as we opted for the V60 with our day 34 recipe. And the coffee is the best that it had been to this point by a distance, as the papery and savory qualities both seem to have dissipated in place of a first time more prominent stone fruit quality, as this time it was the most peachy it had been up to this point, and that was the most pronounced characteristic to it. Cleaner, sweeter, more intense, better defined, prominent hard candy sweetness to it as well, so significantly improved all around. Day 43 through the Chemex. And it's pretty reminiscent of that day 37 mark, as the Chemex didn't seem to have a single good day with this coffee, as it had a little bit of that savory meat-like quality off brew before it cooled down into a little bit more of a candied sweet experience and a bit more of the lemon quality to it. And it's for that reason that I definitely didn't want to go back to this brew method, as off brew, it just really seemed to struggle with this brew method specifically. So on day 46, back through the V60 with lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee does continue to remain at its best, with this recipe offering a very straightforward representation of a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee with a focus on the floral and citric qualities, and I ran out of notes for this one. I kept going back to the papery quality in these notes, mostly because of just how prominent it was within the first handful of days, but towards the end, it definitely did seem to dissipate, and it was still in the back of my mind every time I brewed this coffee because I was so concerned that it was just going to be so papery throughout. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. This looks like a washed Ethiopian tasting wheel. Let's go through them. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Of the coffees that we are discussing from these Japanese-based coffee roasters, this one is definitely the cleanest, but it's not surprising in paper. On paper, in theory, it should be the cleanest of the coffees. It is a washed Ethiopian Gesha, but it never really stood a chance of scoring that level 5 in terms of cleanliness. It's probably just there at the level 4, maybe slightly higher side of the level 4. There are enough qualities to take away from the overall cleanliness, especially in the earlier days, that savory meat quality, that papery quality to it. But when this coffee's at its best, it's very clean, very well defined, and the cleanest of those 4. Finish, level 4. I really appreciated the way that this coffee did finish, especially given that it had such a prominent sweet candy feel to it, especially within that finish. So at times a little bit more citric, at times a little bit more stone fruit, but for the most part pretty sweet regardless. That's where the sweetness does come into play, level 4. I'm telling you, the first couple of days that we brewed this coffee, I was wondering if it was going to surpass the level 2 mark because it was just so generic and lacking that I wouldn't have been surprised if it hardly scratched even being at a level 3 mark. But working with this coffee a little bit more and just kind of seeing this coffee opened up, it definitely did make for a significant change, as on those earlier days, it really wasn't anything worth noting. But towards the end, I definitely saw a lot more of the characteristics I was expecting from this coffee. Florality, level 4. I can't quite recall what sort of floral note that they have listed on here. Do they have any sort of floral note? Jasmine, and a pretty generic floral note to it as well. Mandarin is the other note that they have listed on here. But I can kind of see that. It's not necessarily the most well-defined floral aspect, which is largely why I didn't highlight it too often throughout the entirety of this review. For me, it was much more focused on the citric qualities of it, so for that reason, I can see it at the level 4, though maybe a little bit of the higher side of the level 3 mark for that one. Citrus fruit, level 4. As mentioned, they have mandarin. I could definitely see that. It was a little bit sweeter in that sense, but at the same time, I also saw a little bit more of those bitter citric qualities to it, so lemon also makes a little bit more sense, but for the fruit qualities, the citric qualities of it were the most abundant within this one. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3's acidity. Level 3, not necessarily the brightest coffee, though I think that given what this coffee is, it probably shouldn't have reached that level 4 mark. I think the Lilo coffee was an exception to that rule. I'm not entirely sure why that coffee was as bright as it was, but this is probably a bit more of an expectation for a wash-processed Ethiopian Gesha. Stone fruit, level 3. I definitely felt some traces of peach throughout the entirety of this one. I should say post the papery quality days. But on the later days when I was getting a little bit more depth from this coffee, I could definitely see a lot more of the peachiness in this one. Caramel, level 3. I really appreciate that they have a sweet candy note listed on here, primarily because with the earlier days and having such a lacking level of sweetness, I was really hopeful that we could experience that with more time and with some adjustments, and that was definitely the case. I really appreciated that about this coffee. That and the more moderate peachiness were my 2 favorite qualities of this coffee. So there are definitely some positives to take away from this one. And then the final thing worth discussing, we have the body, level 2. Even with this one being a wash-processed Ethiopian Gesha, it wasn't truly tea-like. I think this one being a little bit more developed, not necessarily the lightest coffee in general, did seem to play a slight role in that, as in theory I could have seen this scoring as low as a level 1, but it did have just a little bit more body and texture to it, so level 2 where we opted to put it. Outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I hadn't really thought about this coffee too much after we had finished taking all the notes and working on the tasting wheel. So this is kind of my first time to actually reflect on it. And I'm not entirely sure what I have to say. The first handful of days, I had such low expectations based off of the results that having this coffee turn out as nice as it did by the end was definitely refreshing. If you haven't caught on at this point, we've actually been reviewing these coffees in order of which ones I enjoyed the most. So my least favorite was at Sloth. My next least favorite was the Lilo coffee. And then this one was my second favorite of the 4 coffees that we are discussing that we did receive. And I think the main reason for that is because it improved greatly with time. The sweetness in this one was pretty nice towards the end, really nice level of cleanliness to it. But I think maybe there's a little bit of being underwhelmed by this one since it is a washed Ethiopian Gesha. So in theory, I would have loved for more cleanliness to it. I would have loved for less tinkering and adjustments needed to get this coffee to a point that I did enjoy. But if we're just kind of taking it at its very best, it did have some really nice positives, especially pertaining to sweetness overall. So I think this coffee was, I guess, by the end, better than I was expecting based off the early impressions of it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, hadn't thought of that either. So this one's a little bit of a tricky one. I think it requires a little bit more patience. I'm not entirely sure why it took as much time as it did to open up, especially given that it's not necessarily the latest coffee out there. But you are rewarded with a pretty Gesha-like experience in certain regards, so definitely plenty of citric qualities to it. Some prominent florals as well as stone fruit qualities giving it some depth, but primarily the sweetness is what's going to set this one apart from a lot of other coffees within the same sort of category. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Sloth, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bench Maji Gesha wash processed Ethiopia from Sloth Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.